Welcome everyone to another edition of the Classic Comic Archive, a series where I recap and review many of Marvel Comics' most seminal early issues. Our story for today is Journey into Mystery 88, cover dated January of 1963. The issue was written by Stan Lee and Larry Lieber, drawn by Jack Kirby, inked by Dick Ayers, and lettered by Art Simic. Our issue opens up with a striking splash page, teasing Thor's coming battle with the wicked Loki. But before we can witness such an epic showdown, we must first travel back to the events of Journey into Mystery 85. It was in that issue that Thor had first defeated Loki on Earth, and then humiliatingly returned him to Asgard. That's where this issue begins, as the trickster god is being punished by their father Odin, the king of the Norse gods. But his sentence is surprisingly light, as he's simply forbidden from leaving Asgard again. So Loki accepts the punishment, and for a time remains in the mythic land as promised. But his thirst for revenge eventually gets the better of him, and he starts scheming against his half-brother yet again. He decides to be more methodical this time, and partakes in an ancient ritual that allows him to spy on Thor. Through a magical cloud of smoke, he watches as the thunder god escapes from a set of tight chains by transforming back into his mortal form of Dr. Donald Blake, as seen in Journey into Mystery 87. In this form, the chains fit loosely around him, and he can easily slip out of them. But to transform back into the mighty Thor, all that Blake does is pick up his hammer. Thus Loki realizes that his half-brother's power is tied to the weapon, and that if he's without it for more than a minute, he'll revert back to the form of an ordinary mortal. Loki sees this as an exploitable weakness, and takes the next several days to study both Thor and Dr. Blake. Once he's learned all that he can, he's ready to return to Earth and get his revenge. Yet the only way there is through the Rainbow Bridge, which is guarded by Heimdall the Gatekeeper. Loki knows that Heimdall would never let him pass considering his punishment, so he instead magically transforms into a snake, and slithers past him unnoticed. But the issue then shifts forward several minutes later into the medical office of Dr. Blake, as an old man is entering the reception room. Normally Blake's nurse Jane would greet visitors like him. But this time she doesn't have the chance, as the old man immediately hypnotizes her. He forces her to let him through to the doctor, but not before whispering a secret command into her ear. It's not clear what it is, but he orders her to obey it when the time comes. But until then, he enters the laboratory of Dr. Blake. The physician doesn't recognize him as one of his patients, and demands to know how he'd gotten past Jane. The old man answers the question by removing an elastic mask, and revealing that he's actually Loki in disguise. Knowing that his mortal form would be no match against the tricksters, Dr. Blake immediately strikes his cane on the ground to transform into Thor. As the god of thunder, he presses Loki on how he discovered his secret identity. But Loki refuses to say, and instead challenges Thor to a battle, while threatening to unleash chaos if he refuses. Thus Thor has no choice but to accept it, and is told to meet his foe at Central Park in an hour. With that, Loki disappears, giving Thor an opportunity to transform back into Dr. Blake and check up on Jane. She seems normal enough, so just shy of an hour later, he leaves his office for Central Park. But what he doesn't realize is that Loki's command was for her to secretly follow him. But before this can be explored any further, the issue shifts forward a few minutes later as Thor is arriving in Central Park. He doesn't waste any time in beginning his battle with Loki, as he then mightily hurls his hammer at his half-brother. But the trickster god simply steps out of its path, just as Jane is arriving as he had planned. Using his powers of illusion, he casts the image of a vicious tiger behind her. Thor is alerted to its presence, and foolishly assumes that it's real. Thus he pounces on the beast to save her, but in the process abandons his hammer. After nearly a minute, he manages to slay the tiger, but is too slow to retrieve his hammer before being forced back into the form of Donald Blake. He of course rushes to pick it back up, but is stopped by a magical force field that Loki casts around it. With Thor seemingly defeated, Loki declares victory, and then flies off to unleash chaos against the helpless city. Thus Blake is left to tend to Jane, who'd fainted at the sight of the tiger. Luckily she didn't sustain any injuries from her fall, and quickly awakens. She's left with little memory of her time in Loki's trance, so Dr. Blake takes her back to his office. But in the meantime, Loki is wreaking havoc across the city, as he's transforming its residents into blank beings. Yet this trick can only satisfy him for a few minutes, so he returns them to normal, and shifts his attention to the city itself. He magically transforms its streets, buildings, and cars into candy, which begins melting under the hot sun. But even this proves a quick bore, as Loki then leaves the city and heads to the Arctic. He happens to arrive there just as a Soviet jet is preparing to drop an experimental bomb. But only moments before it's set to strike the Arctic Sea, Loki swoops in and magically renders it useless. This act and others don't go unnoticed, as a terrified populace fear what Loki will do next, while wondering why Thor hasn't risen up to stop him. It's of course because he's trapped in the weak form of Dr. Blake, who is within his laboratory, trying to think up a way to defeat Loki. He knows that the trickster's mayhem has just been a series of senseless pranks, but will eventually devolve into more deadly chaos. Thus he recognizes the urgency in regaining control of his hammer, but is struggling to find a way to do so. It's then that the issue briefly shifts focus back to Loki, as he's being confronted by a group of soldiers. They're on orders to fire at him, but before they get the chance, all of their weapons suddenly sprout wings and fly away. Yet the issue then shifts back to Dr. Blake, as he's finally worked out a way to defeat Loki. But his plan takes time, so the issue then shifts forward a day later, as Loki is walking past a loudly shouting newsboy. The young salesman reveals that Thor has publicly declared his intent to defeat Loki. The trickster knows that this can't be possible, as the hero's hammer is trapped under his force field. But Loki then realizes that he hasn't checked on the weapon since he left Dr. Blake, and begins worrying that he's found a way to retrieve it. So he races back to Central Park, only to find that Thor is waiting for him there, with the weapon in tow. Unbelieving of what's before his eyes, Loki disables his force field to see if the hammer is truly gone. But it's then that Dr. Blake rushes out from behind Thor and retrieves it. Thus it's revealed that the thunder god waiting for Loki was actually a dummy, meant to trick him into removing his force field. Now that he has it, Blake doesn't waste any time in transforming into the real Thor to defeat his half-brother. But Loki knows when he's outmatched, and thus casts a cloud of smoke that masks a transformation into the form of a pigeon. Seeing that they're in Central Park, Loki is now one of many nearby pigeons, none of which Thor can tell are him. Yet the thunder god then cleverly rushes to a nearby snack cart, grabs a sack of nuts, and tosses it at the pigeons. All of the birds instinctively begin eating away at the nuts, except for one, which Thor realizes is Loki. Recognizing that he's been caught, the trickster begins flying away. Thor pursues him into the air, but first snatches a nearby tennis net from a pair of players. When he then reaches his fleeing foe, he tangles him within the net. Seeing as he's still within the form of a pigeon, Loki is helpless to escape, and is easily taken by Thor back to Asgard. There, Odin praises his firstborn son for once again saving the day, while of course chiding Loki for the chaotic mayhem he'd wrought on Earth. That concludes Journey into Mystery 88, and another episode of the Classic Comic Archive. But as always, I would like to offer a brief review of this issue. Overall, I thought that this was a solid, if somewhat derivative story. While there was nothing wrong with it, it did recycle a number of elements from Loki's first appearance in Journey into Mystery 85. For example, in both issues Loki's scheme involved disguising himself, hypnotizing others, and using pigeons and big cats. I'm left disappointed by this rather lazy repetition, as being a magical character, Loki's array of powers should be practically endless. But in any case, let me know what you thought of this issue in the video, and feel free to suggest other classic comics for me to cover. Thanks for watching.